For 12 straight months, exactly 2 chickens disappeared from my coop on every full moon. I stayed awake all night with a shotgun and still got nowhere until my son convinced me to install a trail camera. At 1:30 in the morning, the lens captured a figure more than 8 feet tall standing in the yard. One enormous hair-covered hand held a helpless chicken, while the Bigfoot calmly ate in front of the camera with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than violence. If you were Walt, would you chase him off or keep watching this giant thief? Leave your choice and the name of your city in the comments. Hello everyone, I'm Victor from Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. Tonight's account from West Virginia has been recreated as a work of creative fiction. The details have been shaped for storytelling, but the strange regularity behind these visits is the mystery at the heart of what follows. Don't forget to subscribe, and let's find out what was really behind the Pruitt Farm's full moon feasts. Walt Pruitt had lived at the edge of Monongahela National Forest for so long that he thought of the woods as an extension of his farm. Beyond the chicken yard fence, maples, oaks, and ferns covered the hillside, leading into remote country that few people ever entered. Walt was 52 and had run that small poultry farm for 20 years. It was not an industrial operation. His flock changed with the seasons and usually stayed somewhere between 50 and 60 birds, enough to supply eggs to several stores in town, 2 family diners, and a handful of regular customers who picked up orders every weekend. The work did not make him rich, but it gave him the steady rhythm he needed after his wife died. Ellen had passed 3 years earlier after a long illness. After the funeral, Denny suggested that his father sell the farm and move closer to him in town. Walt refused. He did not say how empty the house felt at night, or how often he still set 2 cups on the kitchen table without thinking. He only said the farm needed looking after. The chickens could not feed themselves, and he was not old enough to retire. Denny understood that the farm was how his father held on to the life he had known, so he did not push. Denny was 24 and worked at a farm equipment repair shop in a town almost 40 minutes from the property. He usually came by on Saturday afternoons with groceries, then helped repair fencing, replace sheets of roofing metal, or inspect Walt's old pickup truck. Father and son were not the kind of men who sat for hours talking about their feelings. They communicated through work. A damaged wire replaced, a hinge oiled, a quiet dinner that never felt uncomfortable. For Walt, that was enough. The farm sat at the end of a narrow gravel road where cell service came and went, and there were no streetlights at all. Low pasture and a small creek lay out front. Behind the house stood the chicken coop, a storage shed, a sloping yard, and then the forest. Walt knew the area had black bears, red foxes, skunks, raccoons, and the occasional bobcat. He had seen enough tracks around the fence to identify most of them at a glance. That was why an animal moving through the property at night did not frighten him easily. Over 20 years, Walt had lost chickens to foxes digging beneath wire, skunks biting through the neck, raccoons opening latches, and once to a black bear that tore down an entire corner of the coop to get at feed. Every species left its own kind of disorder. Foxes left feathers scattered along their escape path. Skunks often killed more than they carried away. Raccoons left small hand-shaped prints in the mud. Black bears rarely did anything neatly. The first disappearance happened on a full moon night in November. The previous day had been cold but dry, with thin clouds and light wind. Walt brought the chickens into the coop at 6 o'clock, counted all 58, and locked the door as usual. He checked the main latch, the secondary latch, and the wire fencing around the small yard behind the coop. Nothing looked out of place. That night, the moon was bright enough to cast tree shadows across the yard like strips of black ink. Walt sat in the kitchen working on his sales ledger, listening to the old refrigerator cycle on and off and wind brushing past the gutters. Close to midnight, he heard a faint metallic sound behind the house, like a section of wire vibrating once and stopping. Walt stood and looked through the window, but saw nothing beyond a yard washed in moonlight. He took a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. There were no panicked cries from the chickens and no sound of something heavy striking the coop wall. A few birds shifted, then settled again. Walt swept the light across the fence, the shed and the tree line. 2 small points flashed far between Monique's and disappeared, probably a deer's eyes. After several minutes he went back inside, assuming a branch had brushed the wire. The next morning, Walt carried a feed bucket to the coop before the sun had fully risen. He opened the door, scattered grain into the trough, and began counting out of habit. When he reached 56, he stopped. Walt counted again more slowly, still 56. Exactly 2 were missing. He checked every corner, every nesting box, and the low space beneath the structure where chickens sometimes crawled. None were trapped. There were no bodies, no blood. The straw on the floor had been disturbed only by the birds' own feet. Walt walked into the rear yard and searched for feathers, but did not find even one. The only sign was on the north side of the fence. A section of wire had been bent inward from the outside, creating an opening wide enough for an adult man to push a shoulder through. What caught Walt's attention was that the damage began almost 4 feet above the ground. The lower edge remained nearly untouched. There was no hole dug beneath it, no bite marks near the bottom, and no scratches from small claws. Walt stood in front of the fence for a long time. A fox would search for a low opening or dig underneath. A raccoon could climb, but it usually left prints and rarely bent an entire section of wire that way. A black bear had enough strength to deform steel, and that was the most reasonable explanation. But a bear that entered a chicken coop would not take 2 birds and leave. It would knock over the feeder, damage the door, or tear the opening wider. Walt searched the area for tracks. The cold had hardened the ground, which was covered with dry leaves, so most marks were faint. He found one area of compressed leaves near the fence, broader than an ordinary bear print, but not clear enough to identify. There was no scat, no hair caught in the wire, and no low branches broken nearby. He repaired the fence temporarily with pliers and steel wire, then noted the missing birds in his ledger. By late morning, Walt had convinced himself that a young black bear was responsible, and had probably managed to take only 2 chickens before being frightened away by a sound. The theory was not perfect, but farm work was waiting, and he did not want to turn 2 missing birds into a larger mystery than necessary. Walt started to forget about it. December's full moon arrived with lower temperatures and a thin layer of frost. That afternoon, Walt checked the coop more carefully than usual. He counted 54 chickens, locked the door, pulled on every hook, and shined his light along the bottom of the fence. The repaired wire remained tight. The horizontal wooden brace was solid. There was no opening large enough for an animal to enter. Around 1 in the morning, Walt woke to the sound of chickens beating their wings. It lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. He sat upright and listened. No more noise came from the coop. There was almost no wind outside the window. Moonlight came through the curtains brighter than the old nightlight in the hallway. Walt put on his coat, took the shotgun from the cabinet, and stepped onto the porch. He did not intend to fire blindly into the darkness. The gun only helped him feel less helpless if he found a bear at close range. He switched on the flashlight and walked slowly toward the coop. The main door remained locked. The feeder had not been overturned. No animal shape ran from the yard. Walt circled to the north side and stopped. The new wire had been pulled inward at almost the exact same location. The wooden brace had not broken, but one end had been lifted from its retaining hook and placed crookedly on the ground. That bothered Walt more than a snapped board would have. To lift the end out of the hook, something had to apply force from above or move it in the correct direction. A bear might do that by accident, but there were no heavy claw marks on the wire around it. It looked less like something had broken in, and more like something had opened the barrier. Walt aimed the light into the coop. The flock had crowded into the far corner, but the birds were not in the kind of chaos left by a violent attack. He counted them under the flashlight and needed 3 attempts before he was certain. 52. Exactly 2 were missing again. No blood, no feathers, no bodies, no drag marks. Walt walked outside and studied the frost. Several patches near the fence had been disturbed, but they did not form 4 clear bear prints. One depression was long, wide at the front, and partly covered by leaves. Walt knelt and measured it with his hand. The mark was more than 1 foot long, but too vague to support a conclusion. It could have been 2 prints overlapping. It could have been a patch of sinking ground. He followed the compressed leaves toward the forest for about 30 yards before losing the trail on stone. There was no sound ahead. Still, Walt felt watched. It was not evidence, only the physical unease that came when a dark space between 2 trees seemed to change shape. Walt raised the flashlight. Nothing was there. The second incident made the black bear theory harder to hold on to. The same location, the same method of entry, the same exact number of chickens. Both nights under a full moon. Walt was not superstitious, but he could not ignore a pattern that obvious. Denny came on Saturday afternoon and found his father removing the entire section of fence to replace it with heavier wire. Walt explained how the wooden brace had been lifted from its hook. Denny asked whether a person might be stealing the chickens. Walt rejected that. A person could open the main latch much more easily and would not need to bend the wire from outside. Besides, no one was walking through the forest at midnight to take only 2 chickens. Denny suggested installing a camera. Walt said a camera would not stop a bear. He wanted to set a bell trap and stay awake during the next full moon. Denny did not argue. He only helped stretch the new wire into place and marked January's full moon on the kitchen calendar with a red pen. Walt prepared in advance for the 3rd full moon night. He brought the flock inside early, counted all 60 chickens, checked the new fencing, and tied 3 metal cans to the section that had been bent before. A thin cord connected the cans to the wooden brace. If anything touched it with force, the noise should have been enough to wake him. Walt placed a chair inside the shed and brought coffee, a flashlight, and the shotgun. From a gap beside the door, he could see most of the chicken yard. The moon rose after 8 o'clock, shining white across the metal roof and the leafless trees. He stayed awake until midnight, then 1 o'clock. Nothing happened except the distant call of an owl. Near 2, Walt's eyelids grew heavy. He had just bent down to pour coffee when he heard one faint metallic sound, only once. Not the cans crashing together, but more like a hook being lifted and set down. Walt jumped up, opened the shed door, and aimed the flashlight toward the coop. A large dark shape had just disappeared behind the corner of the fence. For one moment, he saw its upper body rise higher than the gate before it blended into the forest. There was no sound of an animal running on 4 feet. Instead, he heard 2 heavy steps, evenly spaced. Then, nothing. He approached the fence with the shotgun still pointed down. All 3 cans remained attached, and only one moved slightly. The wooden brace had been lifted from its hook. The wire had been bent inward just enough to create an opening. Inside, the chickens had crowded to one side. Walt counted them, 58. Exactly 2 were missing for the 3rd month in a row. He stood under the moonlight, looked at the neatly opened gap, then stared into the forest where the shape had disappeared. The black bear theory could no longer explain what he had seen. Bears did not lift hooks, avoid bell traps, and take exactly 2 chickens for 3 straight months. The following morning, Walt took the kitchen calendar down. He circled 3 consecutive full moons and wrote the same number beside each date, 2. For the first time, he stopped calling what had happened an accident. The thing Walt trusted most about farm life was that every problem left a sign. A squeaking hinge warned that it was beginning to fail. A chicken separating from the flock was often getting sick. A sagging fence meant the ground beneath it had softened. For 20 years, he had relied on signs like those to repair problems before they became losses. That was why the missing chickens were not the only part that bothered him. The scene did not tell a familiar story. There was no rush, panic, or greed. Whoever entered the coop seemed to know what was wanted, where the opening should be made, and when it was time to leave. Walt was not ready to call that intelligence, but he could no longer dismiss it as a natural accident. He called it a pattern. After the third disappearance, Walt Pruett began treating the situation like a problem that needed to be documented, not a string of unrelated risks. He took the brown-covered notebook he normally used to track egg counts, feed usage, and vaccination dates, turned to a blank page, and wrote the first 3 entries. Each line included the date, the number of chickens before the coop was locked, the number remaining the next morning, the condition of the fence, and the weather, overnight. Beside all 3 dates, Walt circled the same note: full moon, 2 missing. The lunar calendar hanging in the kitchen was not decoration. Walt used it to plan when to sow greens, plant squash, cut hay, and watch the weather patterns local farmers still passed down through experience. He did not believe everything on the ground was controlled by the moon, but he was used to checking that calendar every morning. After the third disappearance, the 3 red circles lined up across 3 months bothered him more than any faint track outside the coop. Walt decided not to change his routine right away. He wanted to know whether the coincidence would continue. The rest of January passed normally. No chickens disappeared. A fox showed up near the drainage ditch, left clear tracks in the mud, and moved on. Walt caught a raccoon digging through an old feed bin behind the shed. Those animals left exactly the kind of signs he had known for 20 years. They did not confuse him. By the final week of February, Walt prepared as though he were waiting for a storm. He counted the flock every evening, checked the section of wire that had been bent before, and set up the chair inside the shed. He brought the shotgun, a thermos of coffee, and his father's pocket watch. The full moon arrived in damp, cold air. Clouds moved quickly across it, making the chicken yard brighten and darken in turns. Walt stayed awake until almost 2. He heard no cans shake and no loud cries from the coop. There was only one short sound near the fence, like the wooden brace slipping free of its hook. When he stepped outside, the flashlight caught a large shape at the tree line, but it vanished before he could see it clearly. The following morning, exactly 2 chickens were missing. The wire had been opened in the same place without being torn farther, and the wooden brace had been placed on the ground instead of thrown aside. Walt wrote the 4th entry. Using a ruler, he drew a small table in the notebook. The first column was the date. The second listed the time he heard activity. The third showed the flock count before nightfall. The fourth recorded the number missing. The last column was for physical evidence. He wrote slowly, as though arranging the information clearly might make the pattern more reasonable. In March, the flock dropped to 49 after Walt sold a group of older hens and moved several younger birds to a different enclosure. He wondered whether the visitor would return when the flock size changed. That full moon night brought light rain. Walt did not stay in the shed because of the cold wind, but he added another cord from the fence to an old brass bell hanging beside the back door. Around 1:15 in the morning, the bell rang once. Not a series of hard pulls, only one note, then nothing. Walt switched on the yard light and ran outside with the shotgun still unloaded. He found the fence open, with several large depressions in the wet ground, but the rain was already softening their edges. The following morning, 47 chickens remained. Again, exactly 2. The 5th entry kept Walt at the kitchen table for a long time. 5 months, 5 visits, 10 chickens total. If a predator was responsible, changes in flock size had made no difference. Whoever came always took 2. Never more. Never 1. Walt began to feel that the consistency involved a choice, though he still did not want to use that word. In April, Walt reinforced the wire with a new steel brace. He added 2 more hooks but avoided using a real lock because he did not want to break the door during a fire. He spread a thin layer of ash outside the fence to catch tracks. The full moon night was dry and bright. Walt sat in the shed until close to dawn, though at one point he dozed for no more than 10 minutes. When he woke, he heard the chickens stir, then settle. He ran outside and saw the ash disturbed in 2 long areas, spaced like 2 large steps. The impressions were incomplete, but the heels were clearer than the front. There was no line of 4 bear tracks, no claw marks. The steel wire had been pulled aside enough to create an entrance, and both hooks had been lifted from their loops without being broken. Exactly 2 chickens were missing. Walt wrote the 6th entry the next morning. Denny came to visit at the end of that week. He found his father sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open, the lunar calendar pulled low, and 6 red circles running across half a year. Walt had not planned to explain it immediately, but Denny saw the table and asked why every line contained the number 2. Walt handed him the notebook. Denny read from beginning to end, then went back and read it again. He checked the calendar dates, compared every full moon, and used his phone to confirm the lunar phases. There was no error. All 6 losses had occurred during full moon nights, mostly between 1 and 2 in the morning. The flock had changed from almost 60 birds to fewer than 50, but the number taken remained exactly the same. Denny asked whether Walt was certain none had escaped. Walt pointed to the notes about the fence, the hooks, and the bent wire. Denny asked whether someone nearby might be playing a joke on him. Walt said, "No person would have the patience to walk through the forest every month, avoid the bells, open the wire, and take only 2 chickens. A human thief could have used the main door or taken a whole sack of feed." Denny stayed quiet for a moment, then said what Walt had been trying not to think about. Predators did not place limits on themselves once food was directly in front of them. A fox might carry away 1 bird because that was all it could hold, but it would usually return if the opportunity remained. Skunks and raccoons could kill more than they ate. A black bear would tear the coop apart once it gained access. No animal Walt had ever dealt with would take exactly 2 chickens, month after month, while 50 frightened birds remained within reach. "Whatever this is, it knows how much it needs," Denny said. Walt did not like that sentence. It turned an unknown animal into a being that could count, remember, and control itself. He said they still did not know anything, and that 2 might only be the number it could carry. Denny asked why it never returned the following night. Walt had no answer. That was the first time Denny suggested installing a trail camera. The shop where he worked had several customers who used motion-activated cameras to monitor deer and bears. The units had infrared recording, worked at night, stamped the date and time, and could be hidden on a tree. Denny said they would not have to keep guessing if they had images. Walt objected. A camera would only show them what had taken the chickens after more damage had already occurred. To Walt, the proper solution was to stay awake with the shotgun, catch the intruder in the act, and drive it away from the farm. Denny reminded him that he had already stayed awake many nights over the last 6 months and still seen only a large shadow. Whoever was coming knew how to avoid light, avoid the bells, and leave before Walt got close. The argument never became loud, but it lasted through dinner. Walt said he did not want to turn the farm into a testing ground for equipment. Denny said 1 camera could not hurt anyone, while a shotgun fired into darkness might hit a bear, a deer, or a lost person. Walt answered that nobody got lost out there at 2 in the morning. Denny asked why then his father still had not managed to shoot whatever kept coming. In the end, Walt did not agree, but he did not forbid Denny from buying a camera. Denny left an equipment catalog on the table before going home. Walt folded it and pushed it beneath a stack of newspapers. But throughout the following week, he pulled it out several times to study the sensor range, battery life, and ability to record under moonlight. In May, the flock increased to 63 after the younger chickens grew large enough to move into the main coop. Walt told himself that if the visitor chose two again, the pattern would become even harder to explain as chance. On the full moon night, he installed another motion light in the yard. Around 1:30, the light came on for several seconds, then went dark. Walt ran outside, but saw only the wire shaking slightly. The light did not switch on again, as though the visitor had moved around the edge of the sensor range. The following morning, 61 chickens remained. 2 missing, no blood, no feathers, no bodies. Walt wrote the 7th entry, then added one sentence in the margin, "Knows where the light is." In June, he changed the arrangement. Walt moved some birds to a secondary enclosure, leaving only 45 in the main coop. He also relocated the feed and covered part of the fence with cloth. No sound woke him during the full moon night. By morning, 2 chickens had still disappeared from the main coop. 43 remained. The 8th entry included another note, "Not affected by flock size." In July, Walt made the main door easier to reach, but strengthened the old section of wire. The visitor still ignored the door. It bent the same familiar spot, lifted the brace, and took 2 chickens. In August, the flock increased to 70, the highest count of the year. Walt believed that if there were ever a night when an animal would lose control in front of so much food, that would be it. But the next morning, 68 chickens stood crowded around the feeder. Only 2 were gone. The 10th entry was the first time Walt stopped writing the word bear in the possible identification column. He left it blank. Denny continued visiting on weekends and checked the notebook each time. By September, he brought an old trail camera borrowed from a customer at the shop. Walt still resisted installing it immediately. He wanted 1 more month to see whether the sequence would complete a full year. Denny said they already had 10 months of data, but Walt needed to see 12 complete entries before changing the scene. In September, the weather was dry and the flock held 56 birds. The full moon night passed without any obvious sound. The following morning, 54 remained. In October, rain continued through the night. The wire was opened again, 2 chickens disappeared, and the tracks were washed away. 12 consecutive months had completed a straight line in the notebook. When Walt showed me the notebook, years later, the pages had yellowed and the edges carried a few oil stains from the kitchen table, but the data remained surprisingly clear. 12 dates, 12 full moon nights, 12 losses. The flock had ranged from 45 to 70 chickens. The number missing had only one value, 2, not one exception. Walt said the consistency made him angrier than the financial loss. A wild animal damaging a coop could be understood through hunger. A human thief could be understood through greed. But something that arrived once each month, chose the same part of the night, took the same number, and left seemed to be following a private plan. Walt was not allowed to understand. Denny turned through the pages and added the total. 24 chickens. The loss mattered, but it was still smaller than what a single bear or group of foxes might cause if they gained access repeatedly for a year. Denny pointed to the gap between ability and action. The visitor could open the fence, walk among dozens of chickens, and return again and again, yet always stopped at 2. To Denny, that limit mattered more than the blurred tracks. It showed that whoever was out there was not being stopped by strength, noise, or opportunity. The visitor was stopping himself. Walt listened without arguing. He looked at the 12 twos forming a straight column and realized he no longer wanted to fire at a shadow before understanding what had created that pattern. After the 12th visit, Denny placed the trail camera on the table and said they could not keep guessing. This time, Walt did not push it aside. He still kept the shotgun in the cabinet and believed he had every right to protect his flock. But for the first time, curiosity stood level with anger. If you're wondering what the camera finally captured, follow the channel now, because the next part brings us to the moment Walt said he had to replay several times before he could believe his own eyes. A like also helps me bring you more stories like this. Now, let's return to that farm. After Walt agreed to try the trail camera, he still wore the expression of a man reluctantly making room for a solution he did not trust. Denny brought the equipment over on a Saturday afternoon in early November, exactly 1 year after the first disappearance. It was a small gray-brown camera with a bark-patterned case, a motion sensor, infrared lighting, and an automatic timestamp. Denny had already checked the batteries, memory card, and detection range before coming to the farm. Walt stood beside the fence with his arms crossed, watching his son open the toolbox, but he still reminded him that a machine could not stop anything from entering the coop. Denny did not argue. He walked around the area, measured the viewing angles, and chose an oak tree about 25 feet from the section of wire that had been bent so many times. From there, the camera could look diagonally across the chicken yard and cover the fence, the rear gate, and part of the tree line. He mounted it almost 4 feet above the ground and angled it slightly downward so it would not record too much sky. Then, he walked through the sensor area several times, first standing normally, then crouching low like a bear to make sure the unit would trigger at different heights. Father and son agreed not to change anything else. The chickens would still be locked in at the usual time. The wooden brace would remain secured the same way Walt had used for months. The bent section of wire was repaired just enough to hold, but not tightened any further. Denny believed that if they wanted to know whether the pattern was real, they had to preserve the familiar setup. Walt did not like intentionally leaving an entrance that could be opened, but he understood that changing too much would make the previous data less useful. The first full moon night after the camera was installed arrived dry and cold. Walt counted 53 chickens, locked the coop, then checked the device. A small indicator light blinked once, exactly as the instructions said it should, then went dark so the camera would not reveal its position. Denny stayed overnight. The two men sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and tried to behave as though they were only waiting for a raccoon. But every few minutes, Walt checked the clock, and Denny tilted his head whenever a branch touched the roof. They did not watch from the shed this time. Denny wanted to avoid any movement that might change the visitors' behavior. The camera would do the watching for them. Walt kept the shotgun beside the kitchen door, but did not hold it. 1 o'clock passed without any noise from the coop, then 2 o'clock. The yard remained still. Close to 3, the moon began leaning toward the forest, and Walt heard nothing except the old heater cycling on. The following morning, all 53 chickens were still there. Denny removed the memory card on site and opened the files on his laptop. The main camera had recorded 7 clips. 6 showed wind-moving branches. 1 showed a raccoon walking along the fence before leaving. The second camera recorded only a deer appearing near midnight. There was no large shape, no opened wire, and no unusual tracks. Walt said the thief had seen the camera. Denny answered that one night was not enough to prove anything. Maybe the 12-month pattern had ended. Maybe the individual had changed its route. Maybe it did not need to return yet. But Walt pointed to the lunar calendar and reminded him that during the entire previous year, not one full moon had been skipped. The first absence happened immediately after the camera appeared. To Walt, that could not be dismissed as coincidence. On the second full moon night, they repeated every step. The flock then held 61 birds. Walt did not use the yard light, did not set bells, and did not sit outside in the shed. He even closed the kitchen curtains earlier so the house would look asleep. Denny lay on the couch, but both men remained awake. 1 o'clock passed. Then 2. No sound came from the coop out. In the morning, all 61 chickens remained. The camera recorded a fox passing at 12:17, an owl landing on the fence at 1:03, and several clips distorted by condensation on the lens. There was no thief. The wire had not moved. The soft ground Walt had deliberately left untouched outside showed no large prints. This time, Denny did not immediately reject his father's claim that the equipment had been detected. He reviewed the angle, checked whether machine oil remained on the mounting strap, and wondered whether infrared light, invisible to human eyes, might still be noticeable to a sensitive species. He moved the second camera another 10 feet away and used gloves when handling the casing to reduce human scent. The main camera stayed where it was, because changing its position might cost them the chance to record the familiar entrance. By the 3rd month, Walt was almost ready to remove the equipment. Denny convinced him to leave it through one more cycle. He installed new batteries, formatted the memory card, and checked the internal clock. The full moon was marked in blue ink on the calendar. The flock stood at 57. Nothing suggested that night would be different from the previous 2. The sky was clear, the temperature dropped low, but the wind stayed light. The moon rose in the east and covered the yard in silver light. Walt locked the coop at 6:12, counted all 57 chickens, then walked the fence line. He stopped in front of the camera, looked at the bark covering around it, and wondered whether a being intelligent enough to avoid the device for 2 months would ever return. Denny did not stay that night because he had an early shift. Before leaving, he told his father not to go outside if he heard anything, unless the chicken sounded as though they were in real danger. The camera needed to capture the entire behavior without being interrupted by light or a human voice. Walt agreed, but placed the shotgun beside the door out of habit. At 1:30 in the morning, Walt was still awake. He sat on the bed listening to the old house contract in the cold. At 1:35, a very faint wooden sound came from behind the house. It was not a heavy impact, only one dry note, then nothing. Walt looked at the clock. He did not stand immediately. After 2 months of waiting, he was afraid he might ruin the exact moment they needed to record. At 1:36, the main camera activated. Walt did not know that until morning. He heard only a brief disturbance among the chickens before they settled again. No prolonged wing beating, no metal being torn, no roar. He remained still for almost 10 more minutes, then walked to the kitchen door but did not open it. Outside, the moon remained bright. He saw no shape from the window. As soon as the light was strong enough, Walt went straight to the coop. The wire had been opened at the familiar place, then returned almost to its original position. The wooden brace still sat inside its hook, only shifted slightly to one side. 55 chickens remained. Exactly 2 were gone. Walt called Denny before removing the memory card. His son drove to the farm in less than 40 minutes, still wearing a work jacket with the repair shop logo. They carried the camera into the kitchen, placed the laptop on the table, and copied every file. One new recording appeared on the list. The timestamp began at 1:36 and 14 seconds. The video lasted 1 minute and 52 seconds. Denny looked at his father. Walt pulled out a chair and sat down. The first frame was almost empty. Under infrared, the chicken yard appeared silver gray. The fence ran diagonally from left to right, and the forest edge formed a dense black area behind it. For the first 3 seconds, nothing moved except several chickens inside the enclosure. Then a large form entered from the left side of the frame, walking out from the forest. The Bigfoot moved on 2 legs. He stood more than 8 feet tall, high enough that the top of his head rose above the horizontal beam of the rear gate. His body was broad but not round, or heavy in the way a bear's body would be. His shoulders were powerful, his back leaned slightly forward, and his head sat low between a neck, almost hidden by thick hair. Each stride was long and smooth. His feet landed in a straight line, instead of turning outward the way a bear's paws often did when the animal stood upright for a short time. Under infrared, his hair appeared gray-brown, thick and slightly tangled around the shoulders. Along the forearms, it lay closer to the body and revealed the length of the muscles as the arms moved. Both arms hung almost the knees. His hands were large, with broad fingers clearly separated, when he stopped in front of the fence. The first thing the Bigfoot did was not enter the coop. He stood outside the opening for almost 10 seconds, turned his head toward the house, then toward the shed. After that, he looked directly at the area where the camera had been placed. Neither man in the kitchen breathed deeply when the video reached that moment. The Bigfoot's eyes did not flare brightly the way a deer's or raccoon's eyes would. His face appeared only in planes of light and shadow, a heavy brow ridge, broad nose, large lower jaw, and a low forehead sloping gently backward. He held his gaze near the camera for about 2 seconds, then looked away. He did not approach the device to inspect it. He did not appear frightened. Denny replayed that moment 3 times. Both men had the same uneasy impression that the Bigfoot knew the camera was there and had decided to continue anyway. He moved to the bent section of wire. His left hand held the upper edge. His right hand slipped into the gap. The fingers moved independently, without scratching or pulling wildly. The Bigfoot lifted the wooden brace out of its hook with one easy motion, pulled the wire inward only far enough to create space, then turned one shoulder and stepped through. No cord snapped, no post shook hard. The chickens reacted as soon as he entered. They rushed to both sides, beat their wings, and filled the enclosure with confused motion. The Bigfoot did not chase them. He stood still in the center of the coop, lowered both hands, and waited. After several seconds, the chickens slowed. Some remained pressed against the walls, but the noise gradually fell. The Bigfoot walked slowly through the open space. He looked down at each group, sometimes stopping in front of one bird before passing it by. The movement of his head appeared deliberate, as though he were judging the size or condition of individual chickens. He did not grab the nearest bird. He did not use his feet to herd the flock. He chose. The first was an older brown hen standing near the feeder. The Bigfoot bent down and brought both hands around her body, holding the wings against her sides before lifting her. The chicken struggled for 1 second, then became quieter when held firmly but without being crushed. He moved the brown hen into his left arm and held her lightly against his chest. Then he continued watching the flock. Almost 10 seconds passed before he chose the second bird, a white hen standing apart from the others. His right hand lifted her in the same way, supporting the belly, instead of grabbing the legs or neck. Walt watched with both hands planted stiffly on the kitchen table. I had expected the thief to lunge, bite, or throw the chickens over the fence. What appeared on the screen looked less like an animal stealing food, and more like someone collecting living things that needed to remain unharmed. Once he had exactly 2 chickens, the Bigfoot turned back toward the entrance. He did not look at the remaining birds. He did not attempt to take a third. He passed through the opening sideways, holding both chickens against his body so they would not strike the wire. Once outside, he lowered one bird into the crook of his arm and used his free hand to pull the wire back into place. He returned the wooden brace near its original hook. It was not positioned perfectly, but the opening closed. The Bigfoot looked across the yard one final time, then withdrew toward the forest along the same path he had used to enter. Before leaving the frame, he stopped for half a second and tilted his head toward the camera. The file ended after 1 minute and 52 seconds. No one in the kitchen spoke. Denny played it again from the beginning. On the second viewing, they focused on the gate. On the third, they watched the hands opening the fence. On the fourth, they counted how long the Bigfoot studied the flock before choosing each chicken. On the fifth, Walt asked Denny to freeze the frame where the Bigfoot looked toward the camera. Nothing in the video showed uncontrolled aggression. There was no wasted movement. Denny said it was not a hunt. Walt did not answer. He looked at the timestamp in the corner of the screen, at the 2 chickens being selected, then at the brown notebook beside the calendar. All 12 entries from the previous year suddenly had a visible shape. The Bigfoot in the recording was not discovering a new food source. He knew where the fence opened. He knew how the wooden brace was secured. He knew to wait until the flock became calmer, and he knew exactly when the task was finished. Every step looked like part of a routine, repeated many times. Walt had called him a thief because he did not have another word. But as the video played again in the brightening kitchen, Walt began to understand that he was not watching greed. He was watching a Bigfoot carry out a familiar task with a level of care and restraint Walt had spent an entire year trying to explain. Walt Pruitt did not call the police, contact the Forest Service, or speak to any local newspaper after watching the video. Denny had expected his father to reinforce the coop immediately, add more steel, or take the shotgun out of the cabinet. Instead, Walt remained at the kitchen table, staring at the frozen frame where Bigfoot had turned toward the camera. After 12 months of seeing only signs, Walt finally knew that whoever had been entering the coop had a body, a routine, and a clear way of doing things. Once the sun rose high enough to burn the thin frost from the field, Walt put on heavy boots, an old coat, and a small backpack. Father and son agreed not to carry a gun. Walt said that if the adult Bigfoot was still nearby and believed they were tracking him, a firearm would make every possible response more dangerous. They only wanted to know where he had gone and why someone strong enough to tear the entire coop apart had always taken exactly 2 chickens before leaving. The first print lay just outside the bent section of wire. The night had been dry, and the soil was still soft from light rain 2 days earlier, so the heel and outer edge remained fairly clear. The track was more than 17 inches long and almost twice as wide as Walt's foot. 5 toes showed faintly across the front. The inner toe did not angle away like a thumb, and the heel had pressed deeply into the soil. Denny placed a measuring tape beside it, photographed it from several angles, and checked the depth. The next print lay more than 4 feet away, pointing directly toward the forest. The trail did not resemble bear tracks. There was no line of 4 feet, no curved claws, and no pattern of hind paws landing over front paws, the way bears often moved at a slow pace. Every impression belonged to one continuous bipedal path. Several tracks leaned slightly along the edge, showing that the Bigfoot had shifted his weight while carrying the 2 chickens. The prints were far deeper than Walt's boot marks in the same ground, matching the more than 8-foot body shown in the video, and a weight that Denny estimated had to be far beyond that of an adult man. They moved carefully, taking care not to step on the tracks. From the fence, the trail crossed the grass behind the house and entered a band of young maples. Dry leaves made the marks less distinct there, but now and then a heavy step compressed them into a long shape. Young branches had been broken at Walt's shoulder height or higher, not pulled downward from above, but pushed aside as a large body passed through. A strand of gray-brown hair had caught on rough bark. It was longer and coarser than deer hair. Denny placed it in a small paper bag, though both men understood that one loose hair could not prove much by itself. They continued into Monongahela National Forest. After about half a mile, the terrain began rising toward remote interior country that saw very little human traffic. The sounds of farm equipment disappeared behind them. Only distant water, a woodpecker, and their boots pressing through leaves remained. There was no clear trail, and exposed rock made tracking more difficult. At one point, the prints disappeared completely across a rocky slope almost 30 yards long. Walt and Denny separated by several steps and searched for broken branches, scraped moss, or leaves pushed away from stone edges. The Bigfoot had taken a direct route uphill, choosing the clearest spaces between brush, as though he knew every narrow opening between the trees and rock. After almost an hour, Walt began noticing the rhythm of the route. The tracks showed a direct trip from the farm toward one fixed location. Now and then, the ground held one deeper impression, possibly where the Bigfoot had changed arms or adjusted the chickens he was carrying. But there was no sign that he had stopped to eat. No chicken feathers, no bones. Everything had been carried intact toward a destination deeper in the forest. Both men understood that the adult Bigfoot might be watching them from a distance. Walt had never known the woods to feel that still, even though wind moved through the trees, and birds continued calling. Every dark gap between two trunks could hide a body larger than a man. But there was no roar, no violent movement in the brush, and no fresh track crossing their path. Nearly 2 hours after leaving the farm, the trail brought them to a low rock slope hidden behind thick mountain laurel. 3 large boulders leaned against one another ahead, creating several natural recesses. From a distance, the place looked like an ordinary part of the terrain. Closer in, Walt noticed that dry branches and leaves had been gathered into a thick layer across the level ground in front. Several branches lay almost parallel instead of randomly scattered. The soil around them held fewer leaves than the surrounding area, as though something passed through often. The first smell Walt noticed was not decay. It was damp stone, wet hair, and cold ash. Denny pointed to a dark patch of ground between 2 boulders where small pieces of charcoal lay inside an uneven ring of stones. No fire was burning, but several blackened pieces of wood showed that one had existed there before. Neither man stepped closer right away. They stayed behind an oak and watched the recesses for several minutes. Chicken bones lay around the entrance to the largest hollow. They were not scattered everywhere the way remains might be after a predator tore apart a meal. The bones had been gathered into 2 small piles beside the rock, and most had been cleaned of meat. Several long bones had been broken at the joints instead of crushed. Feathers were present, but they formed one narrow band beside a shallow patch of earth, as though they had been pulled and placed to one side. Walt recognized brown and white feathers matching the 2 hens taken the previous night. Denny crouched to look, but did not touch anything. He pointed to one older bone that had turned gray, then to several more beneath the leaves. There were enough to show that the place had been used for months. Still, there was no large pile of decaying remains, no rotting scraps, and no sign of careless feeding. Whatever was no longer useful had been gathered aside, keeping the shelter cleaner than the ground around it. Walt felt the answer close, but he still did not understand why. An adult Bigfoot could hunt a small deer, catch fish, or find carrion. He did not need to visit the same farm on full moon nights to take 2 chickens. Carrying food to one fixed place explained the route, but it did not explain the limit. Walt and Denny were preparing to back away and continue watching from a distance when a faint sound came from the stone hollow on the right. It was not the deep growl Walt had imagined. It was weak, short, and higher, like a moan held inside the throat. Denny turned toward his father. The sound came again, slightly longer, then stopped. They remained still. Walt felt the pulse beating hard beneath his collar. If the adult Bigfoot was inside, they had already come too close. He signaled for Denny to move back half a step and keep the bear spray ready without raising it. After nearly a minute with no large movement, the moan sounded again, followed by light scraping against stone. Walt called softly, using no particular word, only letting whoever was inside know they were there. There was no answer. He and Denny moved around to one side, where daylight entered through a gap between the boulders. From that angle, they could see farther into the shelter without standing directly in front of the entrance. At first, Walt saw only a dark mass of hair curled against the wall. Then it moved. One small arm pressed against the leaves, the head lifted, and two eyes opened toward them. The Bigfoot inside was not more than 8 feet tall. When he tried to sit upright, Walt judged that he would stand only around 4 feet if fully straight. His proportions resembled the adult from the video, but the shoulders were narrower, the head larger in relation to the body, and the gray-brown hair softer and not yet thick. Across the chest, he was a juvenile. The young Bigfoot tried to move deeper into the hollow, but his body shifted only a short distance. The right leg dragged instead of supporting weight. Below the knee, it bent at an unnatural angle, not like a temporary position caused by pain. The hair around the joint was thinner, exposing dark skin over a hard raised line. Walt had seen legs in chickens, goats, and dogs heal incorrectly after fractures. The shape was familiar enough that he understood immediately this was not a recent injury. The juvenile pressed both hands to the ground and tried to stand. The left leg held his weight. The right touched down only along the outer edge. He shook, released a short moan, then lowered himself again. His breathing was fast, but there was no fresh blood and no obvious sign of infection. The problem was an old fracture that had healed in the wrong position, leaving the leg shorter and nearly unable to push the body forward. Denny looked around the hollow. Dry leaves had been gathered into a sleeping bed. Nearby were several nuts, roots, pieces of bark, and half of an apple that had turned brown. That food could keep the young Bigfoot alive, but it did not offer enough nutrition for a growing body that could not forage alone. The chicken bones around the shelter suddenly meant something different. They were not signs left by a thief using a cave as a feeding place. They were what remained after meals had been brought home. Walt stood without moving. In his mind, the 12 lines of data began connecting. Once a month, exactly 2 chickens, no unnecessary damage. Nothing taken beyond the limit. A short route between the shelter and the farm, traveled under a full moon so the adult could move quickly and see clearly without making more noise. The adult could not leave the juvenile alone for long or make the trip too often. He needed a nearby source of reliable food, one large enough to support repeated visits but preserved carefully enough to remain available. Walt's farm sat about half a mile from the stone hollow in a straight line. That was close enough for a large adult to make the trip and return quickly. The chickens were always in the same place. The fence had one familiar opening. Each month, 2 birds provided a meaningful amount of food, without causing Walt to shut down the entire route immediately. What he had once called an irrational limit was a calculation designed to preserve the food source. The young Bigfoot watched the 2 men with wide eyes beneath a small but visible brow ridge. He did not growl or bare his teeth. One hand rested over the injured leg in a protective reflex. Denny lowered the bear spray. Walt stepped back as well, trying to make himself appear smaller. They both understood that moving any closer would only frighten the juvenile and could provoke the adult if he was nearby. A branch snapped above them on the slope. Walt and Denny turned at the same time. About 50 yards away, between the trees, a large figure stood motionless. Daylight entered the forest in broken patches, but Walt recognized the broad shoulders, long arms, and gray-brown hair. The adult Bigfoot did not come forward. He watched the 2 men from a safe distance, his body angled toward the stone hollow. No roar was necessary. Walt understood the warning. He drew both hands out of his coat pockets so the Bigfoot could see that he held no weapon. Denny did the same. Father and son backed away slowly, careful not to turn their backs at once. When they had placed several dozen more feet between themselves and the hollow, the large figure remained where he was. Only after Walt and Denny descended the first section of slope did they lose sight of him among the trees. Neither man spoke for almost half an hour on the way back. The questions that had made Walt angry now had answers, but those answers carried more weight than he expected. He remembered every night spent sitting with the shotgun, waiting for a dark shape to enter his range. He remembered calling the Bigfoot a thief, a destructive animal, something that needed to be driven from his land. Had Walt pulled the trigger during any one of those nights, the injured juvenile in the stone hollow might have been left with no one to bring food back. Danny finally broke the silence when the roof of the coop appeared between the trees. He said that now they knew the reason. Walt did not answer immediately. He looked at the bent section of fence, at the yard where the trail camera had recorded the Bigfoot opening the wire with both hands, then toward the wooded slope hiding the stone hollow. Every piece fit. The adult Bigfoot was not taking chickens out of greed, and he was not trying to claim the food source. He was caring for an injured juvenile, perhaps his own child, perhaps the only remaining member of a family. He had found a way to bring back enough food without forcing Walt to close off that source completely. For the first time in a year, Walt no longer felt as though he was being robbed. He thought about a caretaker trying to keep someone smaller alive, using the only method he knew. Walt and Denny left the stone shelter the same way they had approached it, moving slowly, keeping their distance, and refusing to turn their backs too soon. The adult Bigfoot remained among the trees, higher on the slope, motionless but completely alert. Walt could feel the Bigfoot's eyes following every step the two men took. He saw no uncontrolled aggression in that posture, but he understood that if they moved even a few yards closer to the injured juvenile, everything could change. So Walt kept both hands lowered and fully visible, then continued backing away until the boulders finally hid the shelter from view. For nearly the first half hour of the walk home, neither man said a word. Their boots crushed dry leaves, branches snapped loose from their pant legs, and wind moved between the oaks. Those were the only sounds between them. Denny looked back several times, but the forest had closed behind them, as though no one had ever stood there. Walt walked ahead at a slower pace than usual. He no longer studied the prints on the ground. They had already led him to an answer he had never considered during the entire previous year. When the shed roof appeared between the trees, Walt stopped. From there, he could see the chicken coop, the bent section of wire, and the trail camera mounted on the oak. It was the endpoint of a repeated journey between a forest shelter and the only food source close enough for an adult Bigfoot to reach, take exactly what was needed, and return before leaving the juvenile alone for too long. Denny spoke first. "What do we do now?" Walt did not answer right away. He looked toward the coop, then back at the woods. He could still see the juvenile's badly twisted right leg, the small hand resting over the painful joint, and the weak moan that had nearly disappeared into the wind. He also remembered the adult standing 50 yards away, neither charging nor roaring, simply watching. The Bigfoot had allowed them enough time to understand what was happening, but had also kept enough distance to remind them that a boundary remained. "We don't scare them any more than we already have," Walt said. That was the first decision. Walt and Denny did not return to the rock shelter. They did not report the location to anyone, and they did not place more cameras in the forest. Denny briefly suggested leaving food near the shelter, but Walt rejected the idea. He feared that a sudden change might tell the adult Bigfoot that the hiding place had been discovered and force him to move the juvenile, while the injured leg still could not support weight. They needed to act without disrupting the routine that had kept both Bigfoots alive for the previous 12 months. That same day, Walt removed the shotgun from its place beside the kitchen door and returned it to the cabinet. He did not throw it away, and he did not turn himself into a careless man. The farm still bordered wild country. Black bears still passed through, and the chickens still needed protection. But the gun was no longer his first answer to the large shape crossing the fence on a full moon night. Walt understood that if he had pulled the trigger during any of those earlier months, the consequences would not have ended with 2 missing chickens. He did not reinforce the bent section of wire either. Instead of replacing it with thicker steel or adding a lock, Walt repaired it just enough to keep the wind from pulling it open, while preserving the same familiar access point. He returned the horizontal brace to the hook in the way the Bigfoot had learned to move it. Denny helped remove the brass bell and the old warning cords. The trail camera remained in place, but they turned off the indicator light and allowed it to record from a distance. Several days before the next full moon, Walt walked through the flock and selected the 2 oldest hens. They were still healthy, but their egg production had clearly declined, and under normal farm practice they would soon have been removed from the flock. In the past, Walt might have sold them cheaply or used them as food for the household. This time, he moved the 2 hens into a small pen near the bent wire. He gave them water, a little feed, and left the divider so it could be opened easily from outside. Denny watched his father arrange everything and asked whether he was certain. Walt said he was not certain about anything. He only knew that if the Bigfoot returned, he should not have to walk deep into a crowded coop filled with almost 60 panicked birds. The 2 older hens were already separated, and taking them would not harm the productive part of the flock. It was not a gift in the sense that Walt expected gratitude. It was a way to reduce danger for the farm and for the Bigfoot outside the fence. The full moon night arrived clear and cold. Walt did not sit inside the shed. He stayed in the kitchen with Denny, but the shotgun was not beside the door. The 2 men lowered the lights and waited. Around 1:20 in the morning, the camera activated. From inside the house, they heard only the light touch of wire against the wooden brace, followed by a few brief sounds from the chickens. They did not go outside. The following morning, the 2 older hens were gone. The wire had been returned almost to its original position. No other bird had been taken. The camera recorded a shorter clip than before. The adult Bigfoot appeared from the forest, stopped to look around, walked directly to the small pen, and lifted the exact 2 chickens Walt had left there. He never entered the main coop. Before leaving, he stood still for almost 10 seconds and looked toward the house. Walt watched that section repeatedly. He could not know what the look meant. The Bigfoot may have been checking for danger. He may have noticed the change in the arrangement. He may have understood that the 2 chickens had been placed there deliberately. Walt would not claim more than the evidence allowed. But after that night, the same arrangement continued. At every full moon, Walt selected 2 older hens or 2 birds, no longer suited for the breeding flock. Before darkness, he moved them to the small pen near the fence. He left no extra food, did not switch on the yard light, and did not wait outside. The adult Bigfoot always arrived sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning. Some months, the camera captured the entire visit. During others, fog, rain, or the angle of a tree allowed only part of his body to appear. The result never changed. 2 chickens were taken. The rest were left alone. The arrangement continued for many months without either side openly acknowledging it. Walt did not enter the forest. The Bigfoot did not approach the house. Walt left no signs or written messages, and the Bigfoot brought nothing back. The relationship survived through repeated behavior, distance, and clear limits. Walt prepared exactly 2 chickens. The Bigfoot took exactly 2. The fence was closed again. After about 6 months, the camera recorded a small change. During the final seconds of one clip, a shorter figure appeared behind the adult, at the edge of the forest. The juvenile did not enter the open yard, but stood upright and rested one hand against a tree. When Walt enlarged the image, he saw that the right leg still angled incorrectly. Even so, the smaller body could now remain standing longer than before. The juvenile was still alive. Walt sat in front of the screen for a long time. For the first time since the day at the rock shelter, he had proof that his decision was not simply maintaining an empty habit. 2 chickens each month had become part of a long-term act of care. They could not repair a leg that had healed badly, but they might help the juvenile grow, keep his strength, and survive in a difficult stretch of forest. Years later, when Walt decided to share the story, along with the videos, notebook, and photographs of the tracks, Dr. Naomi Ellery was invited to review the complete record. She did not make a claim about the identity of the species based only on limited quality images. Instead, she focused on the behaviors that remained consistent over time. According to Ellery, the first important detail was the ability to select a fixed quantity. The Bigfoot could enter a flock ranging from 45 to 70 chickens, yet always stopped after taking 2. If the behavior had been only a predatory response, the number should have changed according to opportunity, hunger, the flock's panic, or the amount of time available inside the coop. The fixed limit across 12 months suggested that the goal existed before the Bigfoot entered the area. The second detail was the care shown during each action. The video showed the Bigfoot opening the wire, lifting the wooden brace, waiting for the flock to settle, observing, then choosing. He never used unnecessary force, though his body was clearly strong enough to destroy the enclosure. Ellery believed that kind of restraint might reflect experience, memory of the coop's structure, and an understanding that damaging the food source would make future visits difficult or impossible. The strongest evidence, in her view, remained the long-term care of an injured juvenile. Many animals protect their young, share food, or remain near an injured member of their group. But maintaining a regular feeding route, adjusting the amount taken so the source would not be exhausted, remembering the exact timing and entrance, and repeating the same plan over many seasons suggested a high level of social awareness. It required the adult Bigfoot not only to respond to immediate hunger, but to anticipate the future needs of another individual. Ellery also noted that a full moon may have provided better travel conditions. A large Bigfoot needing to leave the shelter for only a short period could use natural light to move quickly through the woods without making unnecessary noise. Appearing only once a month did not necessarily mean the Bigfoot understood a calendar the way humans did, but it could show an ability to remember a cycle of light and connect that cycle with a safe route learned through repetition. Walt listened to those explanations, but always returned to something simpler. He had once believed the consistency was the most suspicious part. Now he understood that it was the clearest evidence of responsibility. A greedy predator would not need to maintain a limit. A frightened animal would not need to close the fence. Only someone trying to preserve a long-term food source for a dependent juvenile would have a reason to take enough without taking too much. Walt did not deny that the first 24 chickens represented a real loss. He had raised them, paid for their feed, and expected income from them. But once he understood the reason, he stopped adding them together as damage. The older hens he later left near the fence were already approaching the end of their usefulness to the farm. The fact that they became food for an injured juvenile made Walt view the exchange more broadly. He did not call it domestication, rescue, or friendship. Neither side ever came close enough for those words to feel honest. Walt called it a shared arrangement. He left something he could afford to lose without causing serious harm. In return, the Bigfoot respected the coop, took nothing more, and kept his distance from the house. The agreement was never written, but both sides followed it. What embarrassed Walt most was that he had spent nearly a year thinking about the shotgun before he thought about the reason behind the visits. He understood that his reaction had not been entirely unreasonable. The farm was his livelihood, and anything entering the coop at night was a threat. But the injured juvenile in the stone shelter forced him to reconsider the difference between protecting property and judging another being before understanding the circumstances. Several months later, the smaller figure no longer appeared on camera. The adult Bigfoot continued visiting a few more times. Then the gaps between visits grew longer. On one spring full moon, Walt left 2 chickens in the small pen, but nothing came to take them. The same happened the following month. The camera recorded only deer and raccoons. Walt never knew whether the juvenile had become strong enough to travel, whether both Bigfoots had moved to another shelter, or whether their story had ended in some other way. He left that section of fence without an additional lock for another full year. When Walt told the story, he said, what remained with him was not the Bigfoot's height in the video, or the moment he saw the adult standing among the trees. It was the column of 2s in the notebook. The number that had once made him angriest eventually became the evidence of restraint, calculation, and care he had never imagined a Bigfoot might possess. 12 months, exactly 2 chickens each time. Walt had once called it a pattern of theft. In the end, he understood it as a promise being kept between the forest and a juvenile waiting to be fed. I need to admit something before tonight's closing thoughts. When I first began writing Walt Pruitt's story, I believed the center of it would be the moment a trail camera finally captured a clear image of Bigfoot, the kind of rare visual evidence any of us would wait eagerly to see. I had already imagined how I would describe the footage and build the turning point around it. But when I reached the part where Walt and Denny found the stone shelter and the injured juvenile, I realized I had focused on the wrong evidence from the beginning. The most important proof in the entire story was not an image. It was one small number repeated 12 times, exactly 2 chickens every month, never more and never less. I once had a neighbor back when I lived in a small town before moving to the city for the work I do now. He kept goats, and every winter a fox wandered around the edge of his pens. He never trapped it and never chased it away, even though it occasionally carried off a young chicken. I asked why he did nothing. He smiled and said the fox had lived in that country longer than he had, knew its limits, and never took more than it needed. As long as the fox respected that limit, he saw no reason to destroy an agreement neither side had signed, but both had always honored. I had not thought about that conversation for years, not until I reached Walt's description of his notebook, 12 lines of information so consistent that they could form a straight line on a graph. There is something about that absolute regularity that makes me think about how quickly we judge the behavior of another person or another species based only on the surface action without stopping to ask why that action follows the same pattern every time. A real thief with access to 60 chickens each month would not keep himself to 2. Only someone calculating, weighing the cost, and trying to take enough without taking too much could maintain that limit for 12 straight months. I think that is why Walt Pruitt's story stayed with me longer than almost any image of Bigfoot we have discussed on this channel. It was not the Bigfoot's strength. It was not his height of more than 8 feet. It was his restraint. Something I am not sure I could maintain myself if I were standing in front of an abundant food source while caring for someone injured who depended on me every day. One detail Walt shared surprised me more than anything else. After learning the truth, he did not feel angry about losing 24 chickens over the course of a year. He said what he felt most was a quiet sense of shame because he had spent almost 12 months suspecting, setting traps, and at times preparing to use a gun, while the Bigfoot he faced was simply a father, or perhaps a mother, doing everything possible to keep a child alive in the only way he or she knew. I do not have a grand question to leave with you tonight. I only want to ask something small. Have you ever misjudged someone or something because you did not stop long enough to ask why until the real reason came out and forced you to reconsider everything you believed? Tell me about it in the comments below. I do not think Walt's account is only a story about Bigfoot. It is also a story about how quickly we call something theft before realizing it may have been a promise. Remember, sometimes what looks like a crime is really just a promise, kept every month without fail. I'm Victor, and I'll see you in the next story.